Hello and welcome to the 909 podcast. You are about to hear a repeat of the 909 podcast episode about My Bloody Valentine's classic album from 1991, Loveless. It was originally posted back in, I want to say 2021, April 2021. And the reason we had started talking about this at the time is because My Bloody Valentine re-released their catalogue through Domino, and the music was finally available on streaming services. We thought it was a good idea to revisit the Irish English shoegaze band's classic album, Loveless. And the reason I'm resharing this now on the feed is because we are doing listening parties for this album, My Bloody Valentine, Loveless. We have two listening parties, the 28th of October, Tuesday the 28th of October, and Wednesday 29th of October in the Big Romance. And I'm inviting you to come along. Tickets are on Eventbrite right now for the Tuesday. The Wednesday is sold out. So if you want to come along and hear this absolutely seminal record in full in a really loud sound system, and we'll talk about it and why it's so important, myself and Aoife Barry will be there. And we'll be talking about this record, and we're going to be playing it in this beautiful sound system so loud. I can't actually wait. I know that My Bloody Valentine are playing here in November, but I just couldn't resist the urge to hear this record in particular on that sound system. So here we are. This is leading up to that. This is the repeat of My Bloody Valentine, Loveless, the classic album. Hope you enjoy it, and if you like what you hear here, do think about coming along to the listening party. It's 909.eventbrite.com. Listen Closely is the series of listening parties of albums we do on the last Wednesday of every month, and if the Wednesday is popular enough, sometimes we put on a second one, which we've done in this case. So there are tickets available for the second one, so do think about coming along. It'll be the Tuesday after the bank holiday, so ease yourself back in. Come along. It's a lovely social situation to be in. Nice place to be in the Big Romance on Parnell Street in Dublin. So, yeah, here we go. Without any further ado, of course, you'll hear the voice of myself and Andrea Cleary, who has just left the podcast. But sure, look, it's worth resharing. She goes through a lot about, she leads the discussion about an episode about Loveless as well. So, yeah, enjoy.
I'm your radio show!
Hello and welcome to the 909 podcast. You're listening to a podcast all about music where we deep dive and talk about topics relevant to the music world right now. It is myself, 909, and my co-host, Andrea Cleary.
Hello. Hi,
prompt.
everyone.
Hi.
That's me. I never understand my prompt. Hello.
I just drop it on you. So we want to talk about something specifically this week on the podcast, and it's not something we normally do, but I guess we've been changing the format a bit recently, and we're kind of talking a bit about like deep dive stuff. And something happened last week which made a lot of sense why we might be talking about this. We want to talk about My Bloody Valentine and specifically their album Loveless. Why? Because last week Domino, the record company, announced that they were signing My Bloody Valentine and had effectively put the band's catalogue back on streaming services, along with some physical editions that are to come, and they're available for pre-order right now of all their albums out on the 21st of May. Isn't Anything, Loveless, and the EPs and rare tracks, and MBV from 2013, which was the long-awaited, overdue, 22 years in the making album. But what we want to focus on really is Loveless itself. Obviously, it's a lot of people would know it as a classic album. We are going to talk specifically about, where it sits now, in terms of, the pantheon of great records, how it is relevant now, talking a bit about, the backstory. It obviously had, at the time, it was always talked about as a kind of like, oh, this was a huge album that had a lot of blood, sweat and tears. There's a lot going on. We're going to get into a bit of that as well.
And then at the end, we're going to expose it all for the scam it is. Loveless is trash and you're all wrong. I'm completely joking. Obviously, completely joking. I'd be cancelled.
The news came out last week, and I went out for a dog walk, walked around with my headphones on and listened to Loveless. And it was my first time in a long time. Well, because they are like new versions of Loveless, all mastered. So apparently the new versions have been mastered from analog for deluxe LPs and also mastered from high res uncompressed digital sources for standard LPs. And so I'm not sure if the digital file versions that are on Spotify are actually any different, but
There's some men on Reddit who definitely reckon that they're different.
are they? Okay,
But
right.
but I don't know. That's Reddit. So
The men on Reddit have
the
spoken.
men on Reddit, you know those guys.
Yeah, but definitely, like, it's the first time I've listened to it since I've had a really good pair of headphones, like, rather than the crappy in-ear ones. And it really made a huge difference. It's such an immersive experience to listen to that album all the way through on a pair of headphones out in the world. And it really rekindled my interest in the band and specifically Loveless as well. Loveless is the second studio album. It was released on 4th of November 1991. We're going to get into a bit of why gestation period of that album and why what happened. And
Before we do that, can I ask what your relationship is like with Isn't Anything? Just quickly, I know this podcast isn't about it, but are you where do you kind of sit on that? Because there's a lot of My Bloody Valentine fans who really love it and see it as like the blueprint for what was to come, maybe a little bit more accessible. And then a lot of My Bloody Valentine fans are just like, nah, it's not for me.
yeah, I'd probably be in the latter camp. I see it. It has dated a lot more in terms of, so it feels a bit more like that of that time, a record of that time, where Loveless is very much, it seems to have transcended the discography and time that it was released in. It is something that hasn't dated fully because it was so different. And I think when I went back and listened to Isn't Anything last week, I felt like the tropes of the genre, whether you call it shoegaze or rock at the time, like the likes of Jesus and Mary Chain, all that kind of stuff that was around. It definitely feels like it fits into that mold, and as a result, it feels like it's more dated for me. It's not all like, I mean, there's definitely signs that there's some of the sounds in their sonics are would lead to what Loveless would become, perhaps. But Loveless is, to me, the definitive document of My Bloody Valentine's work to date, because they are still apparently doing stuff. And there's a New York Times article last week that said there was 2 albums on the go that Kevin Shields had been working on. And but yeah, I think it's interesting to see how, so much has changed in music, so much has changed, that would this album have had a different impact, or as much of an impact? Does any album that's considered a classic, if it was released at a different time or a few years later or 10 years later, would it have the same impact? And the answer is probably no for most albums. But Loveless has endured in its own way as a fine example of, well, it's a completely individual bit of music, isn't it? I mean, it really is. Should we actually just like set it up? Let's play the opening like 30-40 seconds of Only Shallow from the album, just to give you a bit of a flavor of what you can expect. Okay, that is the opening song, Only Shallow from Loveless. And there's plenty more, obviously, but it's such a raucous kind of start to the album that actually, how would you characterize the album overall?
I think for a lot of people, Loveless was this moment in time where everything changed. But Loveless was released 2 days after my first birthday. So I've kind of always lived in a world where Loveless has existed. I don't remember the first time I heard it. I never had this big kind of like moment where it just hit me. It was always there. And I remember getting kind of into shoegaze via kind of the Jesus and Mary Chain and Ride, maybe in my like early 20s, and then was like, oh yeah, My Bloody Valentine's a thing. And then kind of went and listened to Loveless and yeah, it's weird coming to that to an album that people speak about so much as being this like BC and AD moment in music, but living in a world and listening, like having kind of found it through the music that it like inspired and had a huge impact on. So I mean the sound is, I mean, it's often described as kind of almost like a wall of sound, an assault of guitars. A lot of these kind of big masculine words are often like thrown around about it, but I think what is really happening is that it is such it's such a tonally experimental album, and also very kind of, what's the word, like sneaky in how experimental it is, if that makes sense. Like how like you can listen to it at first and think like, oh yeah, there's a lot of guitar effects going on here, there's a lot of different pedals, there's a lot of kind of maybe digital manipulation, but really it's not, there isn't a whole lot of effect work going on. It's mostly done by fucking around in the studio using mics and reverb and portamento and microtones and all these different recording techniques that create all of this mad feedback and mad noise. And then all of that stuff is then harnessed into melody, and Kevin Shields kind of maniacally capturing it and manipulating it to his own will. So, I mean, to my ears, for so many years listening to it, I didn't really appreciate the magic in that, because I assumed it was done through all of these like effects and stuff, like everything kind of after it was. But then it was only really when I started reading about how Shields was recording this that I appreciated like the process itself, what it is, how everything is subservient to guitars. It's my theory is that it is a guitar concerto, and everything is subservient and serves the guitars. You know, the vocals are so low in the mix, the drums, even like for such an incredibly like genre defining rock album, the drums are quite like, they're not really playing a huge part throughout like most of the record. So it's a really interesting album for the way that it sounds like a lot of other things and yet like nothing else, and it's done through all of these incredibly complicated crazy techniques that I don't fully understand because I'm not a guitar person, but it's...
You mentioned portamento, a musical term there. So how would you, like, for people who don't know what that means, what would you say that is, and how does it apply here?
Portamento is kind of so do you know glissando, like if you're moving up and down a neck on a guitar or a violin or whatever, you're kind of moving from one note down to another. Portamento is kind of sliding between different notes, but kind of capturing or like highlighting the microtones that are in between those two notes, so semitones or quarter tones. So it can give a really it can be a really strange auditory experience to kind of have so much going on like in between the notes there, if that makes sense. It's
like the journey of the notes as opposed to the
journey of the notes. That's so lovely, actually. Yeah, it's kind of, it's accessing and highlighting the pitches that are in between the notes, as far as I remember from my studies. You know, like a wham wham bar thing that sort of taps into that. It's that sort of thing, and it's used a lot on on this record. The bending, all of that kind of stuff. Yeah, so I mean, I guess that's sort of the sound, but it's also a sound that you kind of just have to listen to. I mean, a lot when you talk to people about Loveless and about My Bloody Valentine, apart from talking about like the live shows, which maybe we'll talk about a little bit later, and how they hurt your ears because they're really loud. Also, a lot of people kind of talk about how this in particular is an album that they maybe needed to spend a lot of time with, that it wasn't immediately very accessible to them. And I think a big part of that is the kind of the legacy and the amount of praise that we have for this album. Like if somebody says to you, oh, I actually don't like Loveless, there is a kind of like a there's a lot that kind of comes with that, you know, especially Irish people, where we're incredibly proud of this band. We're incredibly proud that this is an Irish unit that's creating this music, and that is lauded all over the world by all these different musicians, all these, like, just, you know, creating like a million guitar players. I can't remember who said it, but I read a cool quote that somebody said, "My Bloody Valentine is the band that spawned a million guitarists who all learned to play the guitar wrong." I really like that. I think that's a really decent legacy. But yeah. So I mean, there's a lot of rumor, there's a lot of contested things about the recording process, and I'm going to tell you all about it. Okay, so we're going back to 1989. The band are with Creation Records, who were described by the NME as, at the time, living hand to mouth. They had no money. It was a year before they were bought out by Sony, 3 years before Oasis released Definitely Maybe, which kind of solved a lot of financial issues for that label, but also Sony helps. And the label needed a follow-up to Isn't Anything, which came out in 1988. And they were prepared to spend the money investing in it. And the band, propelled by Kevin Shields' quest for sonic perfection, which is a thread that's going to run throughout this kind of area of the story a lot, recorded the album in 19 different studios, racking up a bill to the tune of around £270,000. Now, Shields contests this figure. That figure was originally speculated by Melody Maker, and Shields says it was actually closer to around £160,000. And before the recording started, Shields had kind of said to the label, "Yeah, this can be done in 5 days. We can get this done in 5 days." What I've written here in my notes is "that sweet summer child." So, and I mean, as you can imagine, for an indie label, like, I mean, in 1989, 270 grand or 160 grand, whatever it is, that's a lot of money. That is quite the sum of money. It's quite the sum of money today. And the label, after Loveless was recorded, dropped the band, citing difficulty working with Kevin Shields. But why? What was the difficulty? A lot has been reported about it. Some of it is contested, some of it is backed up, but I've made a kind of a cliff notes for you. Okay, so in February in 1989, they were set to record at Blackweek Studios in Southwark in London. When it became clear that actually the album couldn't be recorded in a few months, Shields said the label, quote, freaked. The band were pretty unproductive for a few months, basically from February to September of that year. And then in September, they relocated to Elephant Studio, a basement studio in Wapping, where they were unproductive again for another 8 weeks. Then they get this guy, Nick Robbins, or no, Nick Robbins came along with the studio. He's the in-house engineer. And he has later said that Shields made it clear to him that he was just there to push the buttons. He was to have absolutely no input creatively into this project. And, you know, fine. He left or was fired, we don't know, but they replaced him with this guy called Harold Burgeon, who basically like his input was to show the band how to use the computer, which I would argue was really important. But, you know, he then worked with Shields for 3 weeks at the Woodcray studio in Berkshire. So I think we're on the 4th studio now, where they recorded the Glider EP. And that I'm not sure if the EP was initially kind of in the band's plan, but Alan McGee, who is the owner of Creation Records, remember him, he's going to come up more, he insisted that it would be put out ahead of the album release. Then finally Shields found somebody who he could work with, found this guy Alan Mulder. He mixed Soon for the EP. He returned as an engineer for some of the recording of Loveless, and was, somebody's online said, he was even trusted to mic the amplifiers, which it was actually, when you think about how important that is to the sound of this record, it's quite a job to be given. So yeah, this guy Alan Mulder was allowed to come in and work, and the rest of the engineers who came along with that studio were told that they didn't need to come into work that day or any day. So then this brings us to 1990. Alan Mulder, the sound engineer, he left the project to go and work with Shakespeare's sister, who are banging, and was replaced by this guy, Anjali Dutt. I think Dutt. Would you say Dutt or Dutt there? I'll go Dutt. Yeah, Shields really, really liked this guy. They moved around, he moved around various studios with the band, and they settled on Protocol in Holloway. And things then actually kind of started happening with the album. They recorded their second EP, Tremolo. Then the band broke for a tour to make some money. And when they got back and saw what little work had been done, the studio was absolutely furious with them. They were like, oh my God, there isn't even anything close to an album here yet. You know, like they have the 2 EPs, but that's what, like 4 songs. Mulder left in 1991 to work with Shakespeare's sister.
After that,
he did fine. Yeah, he worked with the Jesus and Mary Chain. He worked with Shakespeare's sister.
Smashing Pumpkins' Siamese Dream, and probably an album that was fairly influenced by Loveless.
Absolutely, definitely. Yeah, he did
a lot
fine.
of 9 Inch Nails, Downward Spiral. He did that as well.
Yeah.
He did a lot of Korn, Marilyn Manson, that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
as well.
I feel like a lot of acts who were inspired by My Bloody Valentine would immediately hear like, oh, you managed to work with Kevin Shields for like more than a month and you survived. Please come. Anyway, so Shields then returns to the studio, this time with Belinda Butcher. It's the first time that she'd been in the studio at all for the album. Up until now, it's just Shields, to record some vocals. And reportedly, they hung curtains. You know the window that separates like the where you're recording and then the sound engineers and stuff? They hung curtains on those windows to block out the engineers, and would kind of acknowledge a good take, like, yeah, keep that one, by drawing the curtains and giving a thumbs up to them. One of the engineers, this guy, Guy Fixen, a quote from him is, "We weren't allowed to listen while either of them were doing a vocal. You'd have to watch the meters on the tape machine to see if anyone was singing. If it stopped, you knew you had to stop the tape and take it back to the top." So, bit of a nightmare. So yeah, Belinda Butcher, she didn't play guitar on the record really, and she said that she didn't mind that because she felt as though she wasn't a great guitarist. Her vocals were often recorded first thing in the morning, 7:30 a.m. when she'd just woken up after like a really late night lyric writing session between the pair of them that could go on until the early hours of the morning. Debbie, the bassist, said, a quote from her, "At the beginning, I used to go down to the studio most days, but after a while, I began to feel pretty superfluous, so I went down less." Then Belinda says about this, "For Kevin to actually translate to Debbie what he had in his head and play it right would have been an agonizing process." Alan Mulder, he later said, "It wasn't collaborative at all. Kevin had a clear view of what he wanted, but he never explained it." But we should note here that Belinda Butcher contributed around a third of the album's lyrics. And
I read a bit about an interview with Kevin Shields in The Quietus recently. He was talking about Colin McCussig's what he did in terms of drums. Obviously, there was a big part of this, as well as, you know, the creative control that afforded to Shields, and he basically took major control of it. But also Colin McCussig was quite sick at the time, so he wasn't able to do full amount of drums. So he disappeared for a few months, and he was the one who would use the computer and the sampler, which allowed Shields to do more stuff.
yeah.
So he was asked about this, and I was like, but I was writing the music and playing all the instruments. This is Kevin Shields. So I guess Debbie and Belinda, playing wise, never really had a role, but they didn't mind because it allowed the music to develop in a much more free way. If you're in a band and everyone's competing to have their parts heard, things don't happen. So that was the good side of it. Didn't have to be bass, it didn't have to be guitar, didn't have to be vocals. Anything could happen. It wasn't done in an egotistical way. I wasn't thinking I have to do this all myself, but it's quicker to do it as you write it. You have to write it and say, here, learn this, and then get a sound. It's too slow. It's not spontaneous, but it's quite common in the studio. A lot of bands, you'd really be surprised, a lot of bands don't play on the records. And then specifically about
huge if true.
Yeah, but specifically, well, that is true a lot of the time.
Yeah.
But about the drumming itself and on the record, we took all the playing live he'd done and sampled it. He was already playing those patterns, but we recreated it. We'd had some problems with the engineer though. The first engineer walked out in disgust. We wouldn't listen to anything he had to say. We're trying to mute the drums, so they didn't sound like rock drums, and he was saying that's terrible. That's not rock and roll. We said, well, we hate rock and roll, and he said it doesn't sound natural. We said that's exactly what we want, so he left.
That's awesome. That's great. And I mean, look, I think there is obviously a element of egotism to Kevin Shields' recording process. We can't pretend that there isn't. I mean, I'm grateful to it. I think he's a genius. But Cullum did manage to get into the studio, and he played in studio on Only Shallow and Touched. So those are the two that don't have the sample drums in it. Okay, so July. They relocate studio again to Eastcote. Creation Records didn't have enough money to pay the previous studio. They were basically being bankrupt by this project. So that last studio tried to keep all of the equipment left there by the band, like as payment. And I think I couldn't get like a proper source on this, but I think Shields paid for the equipment then to be moved. Like he paid whatever it was, or they found money somehow, and they moved to this new studio. All of this, as you can imagine, was taking a massive toll on basically everybody around the band, with the exception of Colm. Everyone in the band kind of seemed fine, but around the band, like, and Anjali Dutt, the engineer, was reportedly desperate to leave the project. Creation Records' Dick Green, who's like the second in command to Alan McGee, reportedly had a nervous breakdown. He was seen shaking going around the place. His hair turned grey overnight. And then as well, Shields and Butcher, when they got back from their tour, they had to pause recording for a few weeks because the pair of them had tinnitus, probably due to the sound of their live shows taking a toll on their ears. So finally, they relocated for the last time to the church at Crouch End in the autumn of 1991. This is like the final nail in the coffin. Like, the equipment that they used to master the record was really old. It was originally used to cut together dialogue for films in the 1970s. And so it threw like the whole thing out of whack. And instead of the one day that Shields had said, like, yeah, it'll take one day, I promise it'll be one day to master it, Shields told the label he would need 13 days to master it. Which
is highly unusual.
It's a really long time. And I mean, remember what was it he said, that the whole thing could be done and dusted in 5 days? You know, this is 2 years later, and he's just coming back to poor Alan McGee, like just all the Creation Records just tearing their hair out, like,
the whole time he paid, and he was never allowed into the studio either.
No, wasn't allowed to hear anything, wasn't allowed to have any input, absolutely nothing.
And the titles of the songs apparently are answers to Alan McGee when he was asked when is music coming, and the first single being called Soon. It was a response to that.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's brilliant.
And the same as When Do I Get the Album? Like, the next thing was called To Hear Knows When. So he was just messing with him the whole time. Eventually, like there is a quote from Alan McGee where he says, Kevin, you've got to let me in the studio, man. I've nearly paid £200,000 for music that I've never heard. And eventually he did.
How old was Kevin Shields at this stage? He was born in 1963. Yeah. So what would that have made him? I can't do maths. What would that have made him in 1991?
Yeah, he's 28.
Yeah, okay.
So not a young man.
Young enough to get away with it, but definitely old enough to know better. So then eventually, finally, the album was released on November 4th, 1991. And honestly, I think, is it any wonder the band waited 22 years to record it together again? I've a quote here from Shields speaking to NPR in 2018 in a podcast radio show thing that I really recommend seeking out. It's really interesting. He says, "It wasn't supposed to take that long. It wasn't supposed to be that hard, but this thing broke us in a way. It used all our money up and put us in a very not good place when we should have been recording this album. I was constantly stopping basically to go back into this whole thing, and it did lead to a kind of a promise that that's over, that going into the rabbit hole kind of thing where I'll go until it's done. I won't be doing it for the next 3 or 4 years. Well, because there's a lot of music that's never going to happen. That feeling never really felt powerful to me up until the past couple of years when I really suddenly felt like this is nearly never ending. That was in 2018 to NPR. There's a lot more. Yeah, I mean, I do recommend people going and looking at different things that people like seeking out some more quotes from some of the engineers and some of the people that were working in the studio. I didn't include everything there because I also didn't want to be like piling on Kevin Shields at the same
One
time.
of the engineers who just spent all his time reading Lord of the Rings instead, and he just let them out.
Gotta love that. Gotta love the music industry in the early 90s where someone could afford to do that in a studio.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's take another song. What do you want to listen to?
I mean, it's. I want you to pick this one because we played the opening track, Only Shallow.
I'd go for When You Sleep.
Okay, here we go. When You Sleep. Okay, that's When You Sleep from Loveless. I mean, it's such an interesting album, and even there, like, it almost sounds like a regular release, but I think it's taken overall as a whole. There's such a drifting, sleepy, like hazy heaviness to the whole thing when you listen to it all at one go. I think it's sometimes slightly diminished by just playing a bit of a song from Loveless, because I think the entire experience is definitely one that is the intention. I think overall, I think there's you can listen to individual songs and they are great, but I think the actual that kind of journey that album takes you on with all of its passages and changes is just really has a huge effect.
Yeah, I think When You Sleep is an interesting song to kind of listen to in isolation. And I'd be really interested to know if anybody is listening to this podcast having not listened to Loveless yet, and then let us know what you thought of the album then after, if you do go and listen to it.
Well, Andrea, I do have our friend Simon Roach, who I DJ at Lumo Club with. He confessed to us last week that he had never properly listened to Loveless, and he's a surprising person to admit that, because you would expect him to. He was kind of a bit older than me at the time, so he would have been maybe listening to music and around at the time and listening to that kind of stuff, but he'd never got around to listen to it until last week. So I asked him.
I immediately demanded that he send us a review.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to see if I can play this for you as well at the same time, and cool. we can listen to Simon explain himself about Loveless.
Explain himself.
So I first listened to Loveless this week, and I was in college when it came out, and I think I missed the boat, or maybe I was listening to some other music, and this seemed like other people had got on the wave and I didn't, so I was stubborn and I decided I wouldn't get on the wave. I'm not quite sure what it was, but in the years later I definitely listened to bands that like sprung from it, such as Chapter House and The Cranes, and I guess there's so much music that I love that did come from a kind of genesis of Loveless. I mean, when I listened to the album, I was quite surprised that I didn't kind of know a lot of the tracks on it, but it does work as this amazing kind of album unit. So it does, like, it's just like suddenly seeing this movie you've been missing all your life. I think like some standouts were like When You Sleep, and Sometimes. Now, they're ones that I probably have heard over the years, but they're ones that to me go, there's so much music I love that's sprung from that. I was just amazed about the scope of the album, listening to it for the first time. I saw My Bloody Valentine live somewhere within the last 10 years at Roskilde Festival, and the volume totally did a disservice to the detail, which is like a wall of sound detail in the album. And that's what I'm now discovering. And very happy about it too.
That's interesting. Now, there you go. That was Simon Roach talking about his first experience of Loveless many years later. 30 years later? 30. What year is it? I don't know anymore.
It is currently 2001, as far as I'm concerned. I don't know what year it is. I legitimately was writing down the date the other day and I wrote 2017. I was like, oh God.
Listen, I just think it's 2020. That's fine. But yeah, that's interesting. He mentioned When You Sleep and also Sometimes. So let's hear a bit of Sometimes, actually, just for context. So for me, I would like to talk a little bit maybe about the differences that make this record so relevant years later, and the kind of some of the details in the recording that we didn't cover yet that maybe kind of help explain. And I mean, one of the most obvious things when you listen to Loveless now, Domino say things like, it's being mastered fully from analog for deluxe LPs, blah, 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 blah. The key thing about Loveless is that it was largely recorded in mono as opposed to stereo, and not just mixed in mono as well, it says. So they recorded the album in mono, and the reason that Shield says that was important was because he said the album consisted of the guitar smack bang in the middle and no chorus and no modulation effect. So to explain that further, so instead of aiming for like a hi-fi production where you can hear all the little details, Shields wanted the new album to sound like a real live album, to sound how a band would when performing on stage to an audience. He said, when you go to small concerts, it's not loads of bass and hi-fi sound, it's mid-range noise and everything fighting to be heard. Very exciting sounding, and I didn't hear that in music, so that's just why our records became quite mid-rangey. Much of the album's dense tone and lo-fi lore can be attributed to Shield's decision to record the album primarily in mono, utilizing an Otari MTR 9024 track tape machine for the majority of the recording process. All the tracks were placed right in the middle of the mix.
Sure.
And the other main thing is that, that Loveless is often cited or associated with is the guitar technique that Kevin Shields has developed that, started on the earlier work. It's known as the glide guitar. And essentially that means the guitar player strums the guitar while holding the vibrato bar, the whammy bar, whatever you want to call it, and which results in a pitch that wavers. He was asked about this recently, in 2012, 2013, in an interview with The Quietus, specifically about the Fender Jazzmaster. And he said, there's something unusual about the tremolo arm on the Jazzmaster is the question. He said, I modified it, I moved it around and put tape on it so it wouldn't go all the way in, changed the bridge so it was super loose, more part of your hand and part of the guitar, so if you let it go, it would practically fall off. But I was really into hip-hop as well. What I really liked about that was that it used so many samples that were half buried or muted, a real sense of sounds being semi-decayed or destroyed and then reused. So I turned the tone of the guitar right down to see what happened, and suddenly it sounded great. Suddenly I had this melted sound. And one of the things that, like, the quote you mentioned earlier on about like launching thousands of guitarists who've played their guitar wrong, a lot of people thought that what was happening with the guitar tones was that they were just being, there was loads of overdubs, the wall of sound, there was a huge amount
Yeah.
of them. Shields refutes that. He says that people make the mistake by thinking we use lots of effects to get our sound. They're always asked what rack we use or whatever. But that sound is purely physical. It's a movement, a manual moving of the strings, the short travel of the jazz master and jag tremolo that gives it that characteristic sound of upwards drone to the chord. We never pull the tremolo up, just gently ease it downwards so you get this drifting upwards until finally the thing's in tune. I think that's from a guitar player article,
Yeah.
as you might guess.
I love that. I think that's what I meant earlier when I said like I didn't fully realize the genius of what is happening on Loveless until I started reading more about how these are physical sounds that are being made in the studio. They're not being manipulated afterwards, or they're not being like put through some kind of like the system that makes them sound this way. I have a really just on the kind of guitar heavy quotes. I found this really funny quote from Shields that made me laugh in a 1992 interview with Guitar World. This is a section of the interview. Shields described how he achieved a sound akin to a wah-wah pedal on I Only Said by playing his guitar through an amplifier with a graphic equalizer preamp. After recording the track, he then bounced it to another track through a parametric equalizer, which he adjusted the EQ levels manually. The interviewer asked if Shields could have achieved the same effect by simply using a wah-wah pedal, to which the guitarist replied, in attitude towards sound, yes, but not in approach, which I think is brilliant. Yeah. He's like, yeah, it would have sounded the exact same, but I wouldn't have done the thing, so what's the point? And I have to respect that. I think that's... it's like, yeah, that's why it took 2 years, you know? Yeah.
And further with the guitar stuff, he says, you know, like, I mean, again, refuting that it's overdubbing. That people say we must have had hundreds of guitar overdubs on there, but there are actually quite few. A lot of the bigness of the sound has to do with the fact that I use a lot of open tunings. A lot of the chord progressions are quite basic, but the open tunings leave a lot of room for odd variation of a basic chord. The open strings clash against the others in interesting ways. Then we sing simple melodies over the top, but sometimes what people mistake as lots of guitar overdubs, they're just these inversions of the chords mixed in the way that I use the tremolo arm. They create a sort of overdub effect. So maybe we can have a listen to an example from To Hear Knows When. We haven't played this yet, have we? So as you can hear there, it's very much a completely different kind of tone and mood than the more traditional music on the album. That is very somnambulist. It's very, I mean, dreamy. I mean, that's the thing about this. We will get into some of the reviews of this in a minute and what people were saying about it at the time. But certainly the vocal style here is something that is so hard to decipher. You cannot understand what the words are. Yes, you can look at Genius and see now that there are words, but like it took a lot of people a lot of time to figure out what they were saying. And again, the vocals really used as a tone and like another instrument really, as opposed to a main vocal melody. And apparently one of the methods they used as part of that was to get Belinda Butcher to record straight after waking her up. So she had a kind of a sleepy quality to the vocals. And then you add it to all that kind of kind of guitar noise, which is very much reverb heavy and using kind of strange tones that people aren't used to, and you get a very, very different kind of style. So
I think
about
this album would be really different without Belinda on it.
Oh yeah, and it's
I think there's such a transient quality to the vocals throughout this record, and like they like you said, they are used the way you would use an instrument, like a string section or a brass section, adding texture, not very high in the mix. But I think a lot of the vocal melodies are just kind of pure pop as well. And for such a musically, apparently like abrasive album, I love how unafraid they are to be pretty at times. There's a lot of incredibly pretty, straight down the line, pretty moments on this record. And I think that kind of, it certainly helped me when I was kind of making my first. Like I said, I don't remember first listening to it, but I do know that the songs that I liked initially were the kind of the prettier ones, like Sometimes and When You Sleep, and the ones that were maybe a little bit more pop adjacent.
Like Soon to me is like such a
Soon,
poppy
like
tune. I remember that.
Yeah.
Hearing that probably in the mid 90s when Ian Dempsey was presenting the beatbox, or Dave Fanning was presenting the beatbox, whatever it was, on 2FM and Network 2, and you'd see they'd just sometimes play this song and you're like, what is this? Is there something to this?
Would it be played on Irish radio now? Of course it wouldn't.
No, but let's play a bit of Soon now just to give you a flavour of it. So that was my introduction to Loveless and My Bloody Valentine in general, and I love that tone that you get there. I always thought in the early days, like when I heard that first, I always thought that it was kind of a nod to Irishness in some way. It was some kind of sort of like trad thing that was going on, It always felt like that to me, and you can hear there's another track on the album, I Only Said, has a very similar tone to that actually. So I always thought those were very evocative sounds as well, and certainly on Soon there with the vocals, you can hear how buried they are. So here's a bit more from Shields about that. One thing that tends to make the vocals sound submerged is that EQ-wise, I tend to use a lot of the noise end of the guitar amp. From that, you get this airy kind of hissy sound all around a lot of the music. Because that's there, I have a tendency not to make the vocals overly bright, so they don't seem to stick out. A lot of people might have the vocal and hi-hat at the top end and the guitars below that, panned out to either side of the vocal, which has a slightly extended high end to make it more present. I tend to put the guitars in the same stereo image as the vocal, with the vocals sharing pretty similar frequencies, which merges the whole thing quite a bit. People perceive the vocal as being quiet in the mix, but if you take it out, there's a definite drop in the level of the track. So there you go. It's just like, it's like using those same frequencies, and that's what gives the album certainly that mid-range quality in view. I tell you what, a good way of doing that very simply is like listen to a couple of songs from Loveless and then listen to something that came out this year, and you'll just hear the difference between
Yeah, that's
the
a good
frequency range of
good
what's going
experiment.
on there. Yeah, it is.
Listen to Loveless and then listen to something that like Jack Antonoff produced,
Yeah,
and it'll be night
it
and
is.
day.
But usually, you know, when something is that old and it has a different technique or it's recorded in mono, you know, the interesting thing for me, I was thinking about this earlier on, is like mono is now such a like. It is actually a huge thing because we have mono out of our phones, mono out of Bluetooth speakers. So, you know, something that was recorded and playing over a mono speaker now, like Loveless, may actually benefit from that.
I don't enjoy listening to that much music on stereo. Like if there's, you know, like there's a couple of Beatles albums, like Pet Sounds, there's a good few albums that have like the stereo and the mono released. And if I'm listening on headphones, I'll always kind of go for the mono. I don't know why. I think there was a big trend. I remember specifically in like whatever year, what do you call it? Hot Fuss by The Killers came out, and I bought it and I was listening to it on my Discman. And it really annoyed me that the guitar was in one of my ears, and at the beginning specifically of Mr. Brightside, the guitar is like in your right ear, and the vocals come in your left ear, and I'm like, what is this? I don't like it. This is like it works in some situations, but in a lot of situations, if I have the choice between stereo and mono, I'll probably go mono. But maybe that's just me. Do you want to hear about some stuff that people said about the album?
Yeah,
then and since. Yeah, okay.
Sure.
So Clash called it the magnum opus of the shoegazing generation. The Guardian called it the pet sounds of UK avant-garde rock. Melody maker Simon Reynolds. This is a sentence I wish I wrote. You ever come across those? Said it's that Loveless is the outermost, innermost, uttermost rock of 1991, which I think is a fantastic phrase. Pitchfork named it number 1 on their best albums of the 1990s, but revised it later in 2003 to put OK Computer on the top spot, and Loveless then took second. The Observer called it the last great extreme rock album when they named it number 20 on their 100 greatest British albums. For Spin, Chuck Klosterman. I wonder how often that happens to him. Cluck. He said, whenever anyone uses the phrase swirling guitars, this record is why. A testament to studio production and single-minded perfectionism. Loveless has a layered, inverted thickness that makes harsh sounds soft and fragile moments vast. Brian Eno, your friend of mine, said that the song Soon set a new standard for pop, saying it was the vaguest piece of music to ever make the top 40. Obviously meaning that as a compliment. Robert Smith of The Cure said, My Bloody Valentine was the first band I heard who quite clearly pissed all over us, and their album Loveless is certainly one of my all-time 3 favourite records. It's the sound of someone, meaning Shields, who is so driven that they're demented, and the fact that they spent so much time and money on it is so excellent. Billy Corgan of the Smashing Pumpkins told Spin, it's rare in guitar-based music that somebody does something new. At the time, everyone was like, how the fuck are they doing this? And of course, it's way simpler than anyone would imagine. Robert Pollard, principal songwriter for Guided by Voices and my boyfriend's hero, said, sometimes when I want to write lyrics, I'll listen to Loveless. Because of the way the vocals are buried, you can almost listen to the songs as if they're instrumental pieces. At home in Ireland, it topped the Irish Times Critics List for Best Album of All Time in 2008, Best Irish Album of All Time, and placed 3rd on the Indos list in 2013, and on the very, very controversial Irish Times 2020 list, if you remember that. That was a big day on Twitter, compiled by Ed Power and Lauren Murphy. 1988 Isn't Anything placed 13th, and Loveless placed 8th. And that was when girl bands The Talkies took the top spot. It wasn't all good though. At the time of the release, Spin's Jim Greer said that the songwriting on Loveless was standard-ish and dull, and said that while he liked Loveless, it was not on the basis of the singing or the songs. And George Starostin echoed this, saying the melodies of the songs are either not too great or their greatness is completely eclipsed by the atmospheric production, which he says hinders us from seeing the virtues of the individual tunes. So just two from the other camp there.
That's interesting to hear the
Yeah.
alternative being on the wrong
I
side of history.
I couldn't
guess.
find a lot, but it's interesting actually on what do you call it, Reddit. I was having a little sleuth to see kind of what the conversations were like around this album on Reddit, and there's a lot of people kind of posting things like, you know, I listened to Loveless for the first time. I don't get it. What am I not getting? And then there'd be, you know, hundreds upon hundreds of comments that really helpful, actually, people just kind of explaining why it might be a little bit hard to get into at first. And then I saw one that was like, Loveless is trash, change my mind. And, and everyone was just like, well, you're just beyond the pale, you're beyond help. So it's like there are people out there who that was another thing that came up in a lot of these threads. It's like there's a lot of people who will, behind an anonymous account, say like, I don't get Loveless, or I don't like Loveless, or I prefer the first album, or I prefer the third album, but they won't say it like to their friends, or they won't say it in like music loving circles, because it's nearly this like this really shameful thing that either you haven't listened to it, or you haven't heard of it, or you don't like it or something, which I find really interesting. And I think that's something that you actually grow out of a little bit as you get older. I would assume a lot of these people are young, but also, yeah, it's not, it is loved by people who love it, but by no means are you obliged to love this record just because it's a classic album, you know?
Yeah, that's true. You know, listening back to it now, I think it does endure. I think it does stand the test of time, because it actually is quite contemporary. It sits alongside a lot of more contemporary classical ambient noise records that are very popular now. And there's a huge like genre activity in those worlds, and I can hear a lot of those tones in there. But I guess, you know, there's quite a lot, say, at the moment. There's quite a lot of ambient music which is very nice or pleasant or droney, but this is droney in a way that's very catchy and substantial. And so if you stripped away, you know, the sonics of this and had vocals or the melodies that are there's very clearly kind of pop melodies at their core as well, even if they're shrouded in whatever. You know,
kind of like what Lankum do with drone and trad. You know, I think there's definitely some kind of a line that you can draw between My Bloody Valentine and Lankum. I haven't thought about what it is yet, but it's definitely there, you know. It's and I think if this record came out this year, it would sound, well, it's kind of hard to like distinguish it from everything that it then went on to influence. But even if someone else had come along and invented, as they're often lauded to have done, invented shoegaze, I think if this album came out this year, it would still be named the album of the year. Like, it still sounds so contemporary. It doesn't sound like this could have been released in 2002, could have been released in 1991 as it was, or like, you know, it could have been released any time from now until back then, and it still would have sounded new and contemporary and brilliant. And even if the genre had kind of developed in the way that it did without the impact of Loveless, which I would argue it would have been impossible, but even if it did, the technical proficiency and the technical experimentation on this album is enough to kind of set it apart from any of their contemporaries, if you can even argue that they have contemporaries. It still sounds so fresh and so new every time you listen to it, and like the best albums, you find different little moments. And I loved what you said earlier about, you know, listening to it on headphones, because, you know, we haven't always had the opportunity to listen to it on headphones. We would have been like people who were listening to this when it came out. Yeah, like when this came out, or like even when I was first listening to it when I was like, you know, late teens or early 20s, I would have been listening to it on piece of shit headphones. Like, I didn't have my nice Sennheisers. Exactly. And it's how, like, I always find, you know, those albums that you go to when you get a new pair of headphones to like test them out. It's so nice to have like a digital record of this album now that you can kind of do that with. Like, for me, it's always like Pet Sounds is like the first one I go to, or maybe like a burial track or something like that. And this definitely stands alongside that as something where you can hear, depending on where you're listening to it or how closely you're listening to it, or if it's in the background, new things will kind of emerge from the music. New things will emerge from all of that noise, and you'll be able to kind of distinguish a little melodic pattern or a little tonal shift that you never noticed before. And that's after, you know, years and years and years of people loving this album. People are still finding new things to love about it, which is so lovely. And the best albums do that.
Yeah. And, you know, obviously, My Bloody Valentine went on to, well, I mean, they took a 22-year break. You know, I mean,
Yes.
Shields himself says he went a bit mad. He lost the run of himself a bit. He ended up playing with Primal Scream for quite a while, so he wasn't kind of making his own music, because I think he found the pressure of all that quite hard. He had a writer's block, but he did when he was asked by the Quietus why he didn't do more, he explained it in a way that makes a lot of sense. I think for a lot of people, maybe because, you know, not everyone makes albums for an entire huge length of time. Maybe there's an alchemy to a particular time and place for some artists that works for them. He says that balance of feeling, energy and ideas all came together, and it didn't happen that much after that. I'd love to find a way. In fact, I'm hoping I can in this period of time. This is just before MBV came out, their 2013 album. But I don't know if I will. That's the sad part. I'm trying to figure out a way of gaining control over myself, trying to train myself like a horse I can ride, because I feel happier when I'm more productive. And I would like to be happier, so I'd like to be more productive. I mean, not doing things is quite soul destroying. So it sounded like he was wrestling with it, with a lot of the creative problems that, you know, a lot of maybe more and more obvious now for a lot of artists, and have a vernacular to be able to deal with that, and have mechanisms in order to cope with those kind of things, and strategies to be able to cope with those kind of things.
Yeah, I mean, he was making Loveless at a time when rock musicians weren't exactly speaking out about mental health. And the sort of the behavior, the kind of manic, you know, hours and hours, like crazy creative control, all of that stuff was kind of just part of, you know, being the rock star, being the rock genius. But actually it's clear that that really took a toll on him mentally, and he wasn't the only person in the band who was kind of going through, or has gone through, kind of some mental strain over the years. So yeah, it's just, I guess, a different time in rock, and it's a shame that it is that way. And also, you know, you kind of have to think about like what bravery it must have taken to release another album 22 years after an album that is often cited as being one of the best ever recorded. Like, that is, I can't imagine the pressure, the mental strain that goes into doing that.
And also, like, being an artist who has been, like, they signed to Island Records after Creation dropped them, and then they never really released anything other than I think it was one cover song for Island Records, who then in 2001 I think sued Kevin Shields his lack of output. So you know, it's a tough one.
It is tough. And it's kind of little telltale signs that we understand a lot more through a 2021 lens of, you know, the pressures that are put on artists, but that we definitely didn't even have the language to speak about even in the early 2000s or mid 2000s even, you know.
Yeah. And you know, I think, like, Shields himself did a lot of drugs and you know, kind of, I wouldn't say necessarily lost the run of himself, but he definitely enjoyed himself away from his art instead. When Belinda Butcher was asked about the experience of waiting to record the sequel to Love, she said, "I had 2 more children and did a lot of flamenco dancing." So, you know, that's 22 years of difference. Well, one of the things that was interesting, like, now Shields, obviously he lives in Ireland again. He can kind of do what he wants. He apparently, the New York Times article said he's a fan of Frank Ocean. So there you go.
Good man.
Aren't we all?
Aren't we all?
And one of the things that, you know, Simon mentioned it there about the loud of the reputation for their shows.
Oh,
Kevin Shields
yeah, let's
refutes
talk
this.
about that.
He says, I've seen them once at Electric Picnic. I mean, it was one of those things you're like, oh my God, they're so loud. I mean, that was a festival show. I'm not sure if it really counts the same way. And yeah, they did.
No, I don't think an outdoor show would kind of account in the same way.
Well, again, of course, Shields, being a very technical mastermind, says that it was a myth that they were actually that loud, and he explains it this way. It's the quietest interview again. Well, it's usually not that loud. Part of it comes from how you measure decibels, actually. There's A weighting and C weighting. C is the whole frequency range, but for human measurement and for legal measuring, it's A weighting. So if you flip the button between them, it rises. If you're on 110 or 120 decibels and you flip the button to C weighting, it becomes 130. So that's where the myth comes from. We weren't quite that loud, he says.
I don't know. Anecdotal evidence would suggest that they were pretty fucking loud. I mean, I think, didn't the music press, like, at the time when they started doing their, the Holocaust section on you made me realize, which is this kind of famous thing that the band do where they just like strum the same chord over and over and over at this intense, like, crazy volume. There were some shows where reportedly they did it for a half an hour. It's just kind of, you know, it's there's a great quote from Kitty Empire from The Guardian, which I sent into the Discord the other day. She said, those who value the review of My Bloody Valentine at the Hammersmith Apollo in London in 2013. She said, those who value their hearing may roll their eyes at the Holocaust section, an indie rock rite of passage, which experience without earplugs is a little like ordering the fowl in a curry house, which is gas. But yeah, I think like a lot of the press, you know, when they started doing that, were saying that they were really damaging their. I can't remember what the quote was, but it was a really serious accusation. It was like, this is like negligence. This is like, it's criminal to do this to people. And you know, people might be like, oh yeah, I like that album, I'm just going to show up to my Bloody Valentine show, and then just get like actual tinnitus from it, and not just the kind of ring in your ears that you get after a gig, but like proper like medical stuff happening in your eardrums. As long as you know what you're doing and you bring some earplugs, why not? I've never experienced it myself. I think I would probably take that opportunity to go to the bar, but I guess, I don't know, maybe you have to do it once and just go through it.
Yeah, I remember, I mean, I don't know if I fully experienced it at the picnic that time because, you know, you're at a festival and it's quite buzzy. It's not really the way. But I mean, their initial intention was that it was essentially, you know, like a sort of a meditation or a sound meditation that would take you out of, you just get lost in it after a while. That's what they would do. And, you know, I mean, sure, that was part of, maybe, you know, there was drugs involved originally or whatever, but it became quite a thing that they would do that would loosen them up and, you know, getting into a flow state or whatever you want to call it.
In the documentary Beautiful Noise, Billy Corgan said about the long noise section, he said, it's one of those things where it was full volume, and for the first 3 minutes it's like, oh, okay, this is kind of cool, and then you're like, this is really too much, I wish they'd fucking stop. Then at about 7 minutes it actually became kind of funny, and about 10 minutes in you actually start getting into it. And then Colm said he interpreted the audience reaction as, we hate you, but we have to keep on watching you because we can't believe what you're doing, that you're bringing this torture upon us, which I think is interesting.
I have a friend who will remain nameless for now, but who fell asleep during that part.
That fair, you know, it is, meditative. Why not? That's totally fine.
It makes sense. It makes sense.
Cool. So that's Loveless, is it? Do you have anything else?
Yeah, no, I think that's everything we're going to talk about with Loveless. I just, you know, I thought it was a nice way of maybe marking, you know, the news last week by really going into it, and, you know, I've been really enjoying it the last week, and it's been been lovely. In a way, it's like it's been our album review in the traditional way that we used to do album reviews, but we're like, it's a classic, so it's
a classic album review. Exactly. No, this is great. So, thanks for listening, and if you haven't listened to Loveless and you've made it this far, please go and listen to it. I would recommend listening to Loveless first, and then maybe going to the first record, and then maybe the third. It would be a good kind of way to do that. That'd be a way to do it. Definitely check out, or rather, I will be checking out that 2014 documentary, Beautiful Noise, which is a documentary film about kind of the rise of shoegaze, like loads of like never before seen interviews with My Bloody Valentine, the Jesus and Mary Chain, Cocktail Twins, and it's apparently very good, and I didn't know about it until this week, so I'm going to check that out, and maybe you should too.
Lovely stuff. And as ever, patreon.com/909. If you like what we do and you want to support us, we do appreciate it. That's where you can put your money where your mouth is, where our mouth is. And you can also put your words on a page in a virtual world on a website
Brilliant.
called Discord, where we are all having chats. And we were having chats today about Record Store Day and things like that, and some of the releases we're interested in. So that's part of the setup on the patreon.com/909. If you sign up on any tier to that, you then get access to the Discord server. So I think we have about 50 or 60 people in there at the moment. And,
It's lovely.
lovely conversations and loving the chats. So thank you for that. And and Andrea, thank you very much as well.
Thank you very much, Niall. We'll see you all next week.
Yeah, next week we're going to do something a little bit different yet again.
I actually don't know what we're doing next week, so I can't remember.
I think unless some other big news happens, we are going to do a deep dive into the music of Italo disco.
Disco.
My favorite,
It's disco week. Yeah.
one of my favorite genres in the world, an absolutely ridiculous sound and music. And I'm gonna take you all and Andrea on a deep dive into some of my favorite Italo. What it is, why is it, and why is it so ridiculous, and why is it so fun? We'll be talking about that next week. In the meantime, check out
Mind yourselves.
909.com for more.
Yeah.
And mind yourself, and we will see you again. Here's a bit of What You Want from Loveless from My Bloody Valentine.